The north slope of Boston's Beacon Hill was home to the African American community. But in the late 19th century, as immigrants were coming from Italy and from Eastern Europe, particularly Eastern European Jews, the black community moved out to Cambridge or to the South End. And Jewish people and Italian people moved into the West End and made their way up to the north slope of Beacon Hill. One group came from Vilnius, in what is today Lithuania, then was part of the Russian Empire, as many of the Jews who came to Boston were refugees from the Tsarist regime. And this community from around Vilnius came to Boston in the early 1880s, and they formed a congregation. And they actually bought the 12th Baptist Church, which was a little further up Phillip Street here. The Black Baptists were moving out to the South End. They sold their church, actually one of the most historic Boston churches, a church formed by people who had fled from slavery, to this Jewish congregation. Then in the first part of the 20th century, the city wanted to expand the school next door to the church, so they took the land. The congregation bought this parcel, and in 1919 opened their synagogue, the Vilna Shul, which now is the only remaining one of half a dozen synagogues that had been in this area in the early 20th century. Now it's actually the Vilna Center for Jewish Heritage, a museum about the Jewish experience in Boston. There are some notable members of the Jewish community in Boston. Mary Anton had come to Boston in the 1890s from Tsarist Russia, and she wrote a book initially in Yiddish, From Plotsk to Boston, and then translated into English. It was The Promised Land, about the voyage to America, and where in America education was accessible. The Boston Public Library was open. People were free to learn. Wonderful story about this immigration. Mary Anton's first published work was a poem she wrote when she was in second grade in Chelsea about George Washington, because she did not think that her classmates, native-born Americans, understood the significance of Washington. So she wrote a poem celebrating George Washington. And she discovered the difficulty in writing a poem about Washington is that you can't find words that rhyme with Washington. But she wrote a poem published in one of the Boston newspapers, and her literary career was born. Possibly the most important Jewish citizen of Boston at the turn of the 20th century was a lawyer, Louis Brandeis. Brandeis, a very successful corporate lawyer, also became a consumer advocate. 1908, he argued a case before the Supreme Court arguing why a law limiting working hours was constitutional. The court a couple of years earlier said you could not have such laws. Brandeis is able to change their minds. In 1914, President Wilson appoints Brandeis to the United States Supreme Court, where he serves for the rest of his life, one of the great jurists of all time and one of the great Bostonians. And after the war, Brandeis University is named in his honor. In one of the many archives in Boston, there is a letter admonishing a young man who wanted to pursue a career in music. And the letter says that music is not a suitable career for a Jewish boy. The young man was Leonard Bernstein, born in Lowell, grows up in Boston, attends Boston Latin School, and then moves to New York. He had an idea from his childhood in Boston about a musical, about the ethnic conflict between the Irish and Jews in Boston, the constant fighting among young people. Moves to New York, is pursuing this idea where someone suggests the real conflict in New York is not between Jews and Irish, but between Puerto Ricans and native-born Americans. So they changed the format. It takes place in New York. They call it West Side Story.